Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics. We're here at the Bruegel annual meetings for a special edition of the Backstage part of our podcast, part of The Sound of Economics, Bruegel's economics podcast channel. I'm Rebecca Christie, here with Mathew Heim, one of the fellows at Bruegel, and we've just finished a panel on the future of European competition policy as the last panel as part of the Bruegel annual meetings. The panel was held under the Chatham House rule, so we can't tell you who said what, but we can tell you what everyone talked about and what the most important takeaways were. Mathew, can you tell us what you thought the biggest ideas coming out of your panel were and what you think the things we should most be looking at going into the new commission are?
I can certainly give it a try. And the reason that I'm a little bit cautious is because the discussion presented a range of views, including from the audience, ranging from calls for fairly clear political intervention to urging caution. I think it's fair to say that competition policy is not only in a state of flux, but potentially at a rather existential point in time, because there has been a significant upsurge in calls for more political sensitivity in competition decisions and competition policy, and a greater sensitivity to geopolitics. And that is really one of the main takeaways from the discussion, and which is that competition policy cannot be seen in a vacuum. It is, of course, not the only regulatory mechanism available, but does need to be sensitive to the geopolitical tensions that are rumbling around the world, and the realities of geopolitical matters. The other main point that came out was that there is a significant focus on mergers and acquisitions and essentially consolidation. Caution about consolidation when it comes to large digital companies, but also caution about consolidation when there are acquisitions from state-owned enterprises in third countries, yet maybe a rather intellectually difficult position to then say there needs to be some more consolidation of European companies. So an interesting balance that came out. Now, to answer your question, in terms of ideas and guidance for the new commission, I think the following points are clear. The first is that Europe doesn't live in a vacuum, and that competition regimes and competition around the world may sometimes be driven by political intent. And that has to somehow be reflected in how we regulate our markets. That means, and this is where the delicacy comes in, the delicate question, to what extent can geopolitical questions come into merger assessment? And it is clear that the economic impact can be taken into account. I think the general tone was we need to be very cautious about the political impact. That's message number one. I think message number two is that in considering these issues, there are really two approaches, not mutually exclusive. One is to look at governance. In other words, to what extent do we have a political input into competition decisions? And again, there was a general view that pure political input, so example, political input from the council, should be avoided. But it is healthy to have a discussion about certain elements, for example, if markets are consolidating and have an impact on the environment. The second point is on substance. And there, again, there was, I would say, general agreement that the substantive tests, competition tests, should not be mutated to take into account non-competition questions. Put simply, DG Competition is not best placed to take decisions on non-competition matters. It may sound.
And by that you mean things like the environment, the question of technological innovation, many of these other things that touch on competition policy but aren't directly in its wheelhouse?
That's absolutely correct. So there are important elements when markets concentrate for example, on employment, potentially on the environment, potentially in relation to consumer protection issues, potentially on data protection issues. And there are regulatory tools for dealing with those. To bring them into competition policy would require DG competition in particular, or national competition authorities, to become experts in assessing those matters, and they would be the first to say that they are not best placed to do so, and our system is not set up to deal with them through those mechanisms.
Would you say those are examples of things that can politicize the competition review process, or are there other things at stake, such as, I hate to say it, but trade wars or efforts to establish supremacy in certain sectors, national champions, things that have come up as we look at these issues around the world?
One of the points that was discussed was whether or not there ought to be a list, essentially, of the types of issues that may raise geopolitical questions. The problem with this is that at its core, it's fairly easy to do. We could talk about dual-use goods, certain types of data, for example, that would be highly sensitive, health records. But as soon as you get to the fringes, areas become very grey, and what's important to one economy, let's say to the German economy, would not be relevant to, let's say, the Greek economy. And then that is where things become a little bit unclear, and legal certainty would be thrown out of the window, essentially, if you would have a political decision or political direction saying a certain type of company deserves greater protection than another type. And this is something actually that Bruegel has done some work on, and you could read a blog post that Katerina Midos and I wrote specifically on the issue of what a European champion is or in fact isn't. These are issues that are not subject to clear rules, and that creates a level of legal uncertainty which markets do not like.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the great things about these Bruegel annual meetings is they give us a chance to bring all of our different work in all these different fields together and get people together to talk about them. And the great thing about these podcasts are they help people catch up on the meetings who didn't have 2 days to come be with us in person. One thing that cuts across all these issues, and that certainly came up today, is the digital sphere. How do you see that playing out in the competition arena? Is it a question of innovation requiring changes to DG competition rules? Is it a question of data being a thing that people can look at in addition to traditional market power measures? What's the landscape like there, and where are we going?
This is a killer question, because in fact, as was pointed out during the discussion, there are a whole host of jurisdictions around the world that are looking into this area in very considerable depth. The US, Japan, Australia, a number of European countries, as well as at the EU level. And they are considering these issues, as I said, in very considerable empirical depth, and also industrial organization theory, as well as law. There seemed to be some consensus in the discussion that there was a common approach that was emerging. Frankly, I'm not too sure that's true, because even though there may be a common understanding emerging, which may be correct or not, the different jurisdictions around the world have different rules, have different markets, and have different approaches to market regulation. And one of the issues that we did touch on during the discussion was whether or not this itself would lead to geopolitical tensions. And that is something that one has to reflect on very considerably, because although it is true Europe is trying to develop a coherent approach to digital platforms, including developing its own competitors, the breadth of these platforms, and they are fairly heterogeneous, so one needs to be quite cautious about talking about platforms in general, do touch upon some very delicate areas of political, geopolitical, socio-political, and security issues, and you just have to look at what is happening, for example, in China, in terms of how platforms are regulated and are used as part of the state regulation system.
Looking ahead to the new commission, what's the biggest and most important thing they can do? What strategy do they need? If you don't want to single out one element of the agenda, more broadly, what strategic approach do they need to take? And what's at stake in terms of the need to get it right?
The European Commission as a whole, in other words, the von Leyen Commission, needs to see competition policy in its overall context. It is part of a puzzle to develop a more vibrant European economy, and an economy that can grow and grow at the rate that is needed to support ambition. The difficulty that we have is that I think sometimes the European body politic has not defined clearly enough the kind of problems that it wants to resolve in a competition context, and so dominant digital platforms is a good example. There is current a presumption of dominance. There is a presumption that something needs to be done. And I do think that one needs to put the horse before the cart and assess what problems one needs to address. Otherwise, the solutions applied will cause more harm potentially than good.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Backstage, part of the Bruegel Sound of Economics podcast series, and we're here on the sidelines of the Bruegel annual meetings. You can find more on our website, bruegel.org, including recordings of all of the public sessions, all of our blog posts, our memos to the new commission, and other wonderful research materials. And we hope you'll tune in again with us some other time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.